Okay, welcome to Heart of Darkness podcast number 2. We'll pick up where we left off last time, which is at the paragraph which begins with the words "he broke off," and it's on page 8 of the Penguin Classics edition. I'll try to move a bit more quickly through some stuff this time. In this section, we have flames gliding over the river, and there are descriptions of a whole heap of different colours of the flames with a footnote. But again, you can discuss flames in the context of enlightenment, but also flames as being destructive, and we can add that flames can be linked with hellish imagery, and we know there's a lot of hellish imagery in the text. In the same paragraph, the river is described as a sleepless river, and this is interesting because Conrad has used a poetic technique here that we call anthropomorphization, or in fact, don't call it that. Call it personification, which is a better way of putting it. To describe the river as sleepless is to give it almost human qualities, because of course rivers can't sleep, and nature at various times is personified in this text. It is almost becomes a character unto itself. The paragraph ends with the listener remarking that this is going to be one of Marlowe's inconclusive experiences, and it's again a hint about the text as a whole, and again that idea we talked about in the previous podcast, with the truth being not within but outside. And again, as we've discussed in class, the text is there's a level of inscrutability that runs throughout the text, of things not being explained or being clear. And indeed, the next paragraph ends with the repetition, "not very clear either," "no, not very clear," immediately followed by yet another light reference. This sort of stuff is continued further on in the paragraph that begins, "Now when I was a little chap I had a passion for maps." Because not only is a passion for maps, well, in fact there's heaps of stuff we can say about the passion for maps. It alludes to colonialism, because interests in maps might suggest the European desire to explore and to colonise. It's also about the Enlightenment, because just as the Enlightenment was about learning and information, so drawing up maps is about learning and developing an understanding of the world. And he in fact notes here that at that time there were many blank spaces on the earth. But what we can say really is that they were blank spaces as far as Europeans were concerned. To the indigenous people, they weren't blank spaces at all. They were the place where all the places where they lived. And in fact, that reference to blank spaces is a kind of what we'll call colonial arrogance, and it kind of reminds me of a few years back. Tony Abbott made a remark that offended a lot of Indigenous people when he was looking at, I can't even remember which city it was, but one of the cities in Australia, and he said, it's hard to think that 200 years ago this was only bush, or this was just bush. And again, that typifies that kind of colonial arrogance of just saying, well, before Europeans came, there was nothing here. It was a blank space on a map, which is, of course, is very problematic. But the paragraph shortly following from that begins, "True, by this time it was not a blank space anymore. It had got filled since my boyhood with rivers and lakes and names. It had ceased to be a blank space of delightful mystery, a white patch for a boy to dream gloriously over. It had become a place of darkness." And this is very, very interesting. Again, it's a critique of enlightenment, because what we actually have here is an area, let's say Africa in this case, that before the Europeans arrived is described as white, with white suggesting perhaps goodness and purity. But then after the Europeans arrived, it had, quote, become a place of darkness. So Conrad is directly telling us that the enlightenment that Europeans thought they were bringing to Africa was a fallacy. In other words, it wasn't real. This is a really, really great moment in the text when the river is referenced. A mighty big river, we're told, that you could see on the map, resembling an immense snake uncoiled. And not only does that suggest nature as terrifying and powerful, it also has sexual connotations as well. And we can call the snake as what we would call a phallic symbol. That's PHALLIC. You can look that one up, but it links with the fact that the excesses or the extreme behaviours of Kurtz aren't just about violence. They're also about him, I would argue, fulfilling his perhaps shunned sexual desires, which are hinted at later on by the native woman, as we'll talk about when we get to it. Also of the river, not long after the immense snake uncoiled, he said, "It fascinated me like a snake would a bird, a silly little bird," revealing that he is at risk of being consumed by Africa and by nature and perhaps by his own desires that he's arguably exploring or learning about. Okay, so there's let me see. Okay, paragraph that begins, "You understand it was a continental concern, that trading society, but I have a lot of relations living on the continent." And when he says, "I'm sorry to own, I began to worry them," what he's saying is he's basically harassing his relatives to try to get him a job. And we get some of the sexism from the text in the paragraph when he says, "Then, would you believe it, I tried the women. I, Charlie Marlowe, set the women to work to get a job. Heavens." And the language here suggests what he sees as the absurdity of female help. It's quite sexist. Now we've got this bit here with Fresleben, which I'm actually going to skip over, not because it isn't important, because it's massively important, but because we've already talked about it in class. So if you want to go into this in more detail, come and see me. And certainly this is an important part of the text that's worth reading and rereading and discussing more in class. So we'll skip over that. Okay, what we've got after that, of course, is the visit to the elderly, or the two women, the one fat and the other slim, which we also talked about in class, but there's a few points that I might make about it. Conrad, certainly, if we begin at the paragraph, "A narrow and deserted street," Conrad definitely builds an eerie tone with the words like deep shadow, dead silence, cracks, desert, and even the black wool that the women are knitting. So he establishes a real ominousness here. And somebody in class pointed out the fact that, and I think I talked about it earlier, the old woman as being like a somnambulist, that being a sleepwalker. And of course, Conrad saw the horrific actions of Europeans in Africa as a form of, in a way, sleepwalking, because the Europeans not thinking about what they're doing. We've got shining map in there, which we've talked about. We've also talked about the yellow, which on the map, which represents Belgium. And once again, the river is described as being like a snake. The old women, I think we need to say, you can get into all that stuff that's referenced in the footnotes about Greek mythology, etc., etc. But I think, at the very least, what you need to say is that they do represent or symbolise fate and the idea of this journey that Marlowe is about to embark upon. The black wool again, negative imagery, ominous, dark imagery, giving us this hint that this is going to be some form of awful voyage where he might learn some horrible things about the world and also about himself. Why the women are fat and skinny? People have talked about it could be the plumpness might suggest the greed of Europeans, as certainly is the case later in the text with different characters who are described as fat. The skinny woman, well, maybe that's saying, I mean, if you look at fat and skinny, fatness sort of suggests having an overabundance or having too much of something, and skinny would be suggesting not having enough of something. Perhaps it's saying that while Europeans are greedy, there are certain things that they're really lacking as well, perhaps empathy and understanding and so forth. But that's one that I think I need to think about a little bit more, because I've read a few different interpretations of it, but I haven't found anything yet that I'm really happy with. But look, I would absolutely love people to listen to this podcast, go away and think about it themselves, and then come back and offer suggestions to me. That'd be brilliant. But certainly it's something that we'll revisit. Turning the page, we've got all that stuff. Again, I'm going to skip over it a little bit because we've talked about it in class. The women are described in a very witch-like fashion, with particularly one of them with a cat in her lap, wart on her cheek. Reference to guarding the door of darkness. I seem to have... there was a bit I wanted to talk about that I think I'd skipped. Maybe it was on the previous page. Anyway, somewhere there it says about the women, or one of the women having her feet up, rested on a footrest. And again, shoes and feet are referenced again and again in the text. Once more, I would suggest alluding to the fact that Marlowe is about to embark on a journey. Now we get to this visit to the doctor, which is an interesting bit. So it says, there was yet a visit to the doctor, a simple formality, assured me the secretary with an air of taking an immense part in all my sorrows. According to a young chap wearing his hat over the left eyebrow, some clerk or clerk, I suppose, there must have been blah, 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 blah. I think wearing the hat over the left eyebrow could be interesting. I'm going to leave that actually. But what we do see as we go up to the top of page 13, the same paragraph, a description where it says he was shabby and careless, with ink stains on the sleeves of his jacket, which I would say hints at the company's incompetence, because they are very incompetent in many ways. We later see that in Africa, where things are being wasted and there's not enough of different things and things are broken. And again, that could be a critique of colonialism, the incompetence of colonialism. Let me see. Okay, so let's get to the doctor. So the old doctor felt my pulse, evidently thinking of something else the while. Good for there, he mumbled. And it's interesting here because the doctor asks Marlowe if he can measure his head. And what this actually is it's an outdated science that was known as phrenology. That's Phrenology, where scientists believed that you could make certain assumptions about a person based on the physical shape of their skull. And an interesting little side note, Charles Darwin, the very famous, what would we call him? Biologist, scientist, whatever. Point being, he came up with the theory of evolution. He was nearly not allowed to go on the voyage on which he discovered or formulated his theory of evolution, because some bloke measured his head and said his head was a weird shape and that he wouldn't have the competencies to go on the voyage. Anyway, phrenology's been completely discredited, but it was around at the time, and this doctor is obviously interested in it. And he is described a bit further down as an unshaven little man in a threadbare coat. Again, perhaps the shabbiness and incompetence of the company. Very, very, very important quote that'd be well worth memorising, though, when the doctor remarks, and moreover, the changes take place inside, you know. So this reference to inside, not only is he saying that people change mentally by their experiences, but it links with the title, The Heart of Darkness, and this idea of things inside, and the changes that take place there. There's something also quite ominous about the way the doctor refers to Africa. He says, "So you were going out there," and that it's just the vague sort of eeriness of going out there, not you're going to Africa or you're going to the Belgian Congo. Further down, there's a bit where he says, "I have a little theory which you messieurs who go out there," once again out there, "must help me to prove. This is my share in the advantages my country shall reap from the possession of such a magnificent dependency." So the word possession and dependency, they're both all about colonialism. So over the page, because I'm going to cap this one right on 20 minutes, which is only a few minutes away now. Let me see what we're going to talk about. There's a bit of gender stuff in this next bit, particularly the paragraph at the beginning. "One thing more remained to do, say goodbye to my excellent aunt. I found her triumphant." The word triumphant almost implies that she's had some victory by getting him a job. And we also have in there, "looked just as you would expect a lady's drawing room to look," which is quite sexist language, implying that we should be able to predict or know. Basically, women should be a certain way, and this woman is conforming to those expectations. Further down, great light imagery, where we have something like an emissary of light, something like a lower sort of apostle. And the paragraph ending with a very, very, very powerful quote and a great example of irony, where he says, "I venture to hint that the company was run for profit." Of course, it is. And it gets really, really sexist when we have the bit, "You forgot, dear Charles," and he says, "It's queer how out of touch with truth women are. They live in a world of their own, and there had never been anything like it, and never can be. It is too beautiful altogether, and if they were to set it up, it would go to pieces before the first sunset." I mean, if I was a female reader, I'd be offended by that. Whether or not you guys are personally offended by it, any of you female students listening to this, I don't know, but it's quite strong language, and it sort of makes you laugh a bit, because Marlowe wouldn't have this job at all if it wasn't for the help of a woman, which sort of frustrates him. Next paragraph begins, "After this I got embraced." And once again, this shows us Marlowe's discomfort around, or not, or dislike, or I don't know if dislike of is not too strong, but problems with women, because he says, "After this I got embraced," and he doesn't say he embraces her. He says, "I got embraced." It's very passive. It's like he's a non-participant in this moment. And you can almost imagine him in your mind, you know, with his arms down by his side, looking really stiff and awkward while he's getting hugged. And the paragraph ends strongly with hellish imagery again, where he says, "The best way I can explain it to you is by saying that for a second or two, I felt as though instead of going to the centre of a continent, I were about to set off for the centre of the earth." And that's really unmistakable imagery of hell there. We'll leave it because it's at 20 minutes. Once again, I note to myself that I'm going through these too slowly. If I don't speed it up, there's just going to be heaps and heaps and heaps of podcasts. But anyway, I hope they're helpful. That's the main thing. Thanks again for listening.